So, dear colleagues, my name is Jürgen Renn from the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, and I'm very happy to welcome here all of you, not just on behalf of the Max Planck Institute, but this is the beginning of a new lecture series, the Anthropocene lecture series, and it's a joint endeavor of the Max Planck Institute, the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, and it's a particular pleasure that representatives of all of these institutions are here with us. They have all collaborated in making this series possible. Particular thanks to Christoph Rosol, Franz Maulshagen, Helge Wendt, many people who have collaborated. Julia Rispoli, of course, have collaborated in making this possible. The Anthropocene is a joint research interest of all of these institutions. Many of you will remember that jointly with the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, we undertook the organization of the large Anthropocene campuses. The third campus is now well underway, taking place in Philadelphia. It has made the Anthropocene a subject of broad discussions here in the Berlin area and well beyond. The Anthropocene is also a research topic at the various participating institutions. Some of the results are here on this table if you want to look at them. And the purpose of this Anthropocene lecture series is to invite prominent voices to debate and to further accentuate the concepts and its implications for the humanities and for history and history of science and history of knowledge in particular. And we think this is necessary in view of the dramatic and destabilizing changes we are currently witnessing. And we also think that with all the drama that is behind the Anthropocene concept, it's also an opportunity for rethinking basic concepts of our professional endeavors of the history and of the history of science in particular. So the Anthropocene concept has been analytically very fertile, I think personally, for our investigations. And therefore it's a particular pleasure to welcome one of the pioneers of this rethinking of history in view of the Anthropocene, Professor John McNeill. Welcome, we're very happy to have you here. He is an environmental historian, author, and professor at Georgetown University, has been at Georgetown University since 1985. He has been...
Since the Miocene.
Since the Miocene. That's a long time indeed, so we are thinking in geological timescales. He has also been an American, a president of the American Society for Environmental History. That was still in the, no, that was already in the Anthropocene. It depends on how you count it. Yeah, not. And he is best known for authoring books that have been widely read also outside the profession of historians. Something New Under the Sun, An Environmental History of the 20th Century World, appeared in 2001, just shortly after the century closed. You already wrapped it up. Then a book that I personally read with the greatest pleasure and made fruitful use of together in my work with Helge Wendt, The Human Web, A Bird's Eye View of World History, which you co-authored with your father, Professor William McNeill, and Rethinking Environmental History, World Systems History and Global Environmental Change from 2007, which you co-edited. And your newest book, which we have been started to read in our little Anthropocene working group, is The Great Acceleration, An Environmental History of the Anthropocene since 1945. And I have mentioned our little Anthropocene working group. You are a member of the important big Anthropocene working group, one of the 38 members of this group, which is an international body installed by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. And this group is tasked with the proposal of preparing a formal recognition of the Anthropocene as a definitive unit of the geological timescale. And it's very remarkable that this group has such an international composition. And we are looking forward also to hear a little bit more about the current discussions in these groups and also the politics surrounding it. And we, of course, I repeat it once more, interested particularly in the consequences all of these discussions have for studying the history of science and the history of knowledge. And with this somewhat long introduction, Professor Neil, I leave the floor to you, and we're all very excited to have you here and listen to you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Jörg, for your kind words. It is gratifying to be here, to be invited to Berlin, which has become the world center of Anthropocene studies, and particularly to inaugurate this lecture series. I hope that things go well enough today that the lecture series will not be canceled immediately afterwards. But before I begin, it is true, as Jürgen Renn said, that I co-authored a book with my father. Perhaps the most useful thing I can do today is to say that if any of you are ever considering co-authoring a book with a close relative of yours, talk to me first. I can save you some family counseling fees, perhaps. So this is a talk that I've never given before, which is why I'm holding my wristwatch in my hand. I won't be able to pace it and time it perfectly, but I'll try to bring it in under 45 minutes so that Mark Lawrence doesn't miss his train, and those of you who have dinner engagements won't be tempted to stampede for the door before I finish. This is what I intend to do this evening, and with luck, I'll keep to that order. The first thing I need to do is explain what I mean by the Anthropocene or Anthropocene, because as you well know, it means very different things to different people. Che Guevara, a generation ago, asked for 1 to 100 Vietnams. There are 1 to 100 Anthropocenes now. They're multiplying rapidly. There are, for example, older and newer Anthropocenes, as most of you are well aware. And I note a couple of the more prominent ones. Bill Ruderman's arguments for an Anthropocene that began 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. Really the original formulation of Paul Crutzen, with a date sometimes given as 1784, sometimes as 1800, at any rate intended to correspond with the advent of the Industrial Revolution and intensive fossil fuel use. I wrote here, and mine too, in 2007, and I'm going to explain a little bit what I used to think and what I think now. Thirdly, the AWG, that's the Anthropocene Working Groups, the majority of that body thinks that an Anthropocene, a newer Anthropocene, is a more sensible position to take. So that's the 1945 to 1950 birthday for the Anthropocene. And I have changed my mind about these matters, which is why I take refuge in this quotation from the American transcendentalist philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson. The quotation is also sometimes attributed to Karl Marx. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds. Well, I have not been consistent. I may have been foolish, but I was inconsistently foolish rather than adopting a foolish consistency. In some disciplines, it's possible to be a bit more flexible about chronology and periodization, and I'll say a fair bit about this later on. But in stratigraphy, it's not easy to be flexible and fuzzy. For stratigraphers, when one interval of time ends, another one begins, and there's no partial Pleistocene. There's no semi-Pleistocene. It begins, it ends. These are sharp boundaries for stratigraphy. So for stratigraphers, the notion that the Anthropocene might be dated to 1800 or might be dated to 1950, even though it's a tiny interval of time, it seems to make a difference. And I will return to that question in a moment. In addition to early and late, or old and new Anthropocenes, there are also good and bad Anthropocenes. This is Stuart Brand, who's one of a tribe of people sometimes referred to as eco-modernists, who seem to look forward to an Anthropocene that will feature careful management for sustainability. That's a version of the good Anthropocene, in which human impact is not chaotic, not full of unintended consequences, but instead is rational and has only those consequences that planetary managers intend. You can tell by my choice of words that I'm a bit skeptical of all this. I'm more in the bad Anthropocene camp, by which I mean I would anticipate that the scale of human impact on the global environment is likelier to lead to an unruly planet with more unpredictable features and more extremes in climate, for example. These debates between good and bad Anthropocene are in some respects reminiscent of earlier debates a generation ago about human impact on the environment, particularly with respect to scarcity of economically important materials. But there are different inflections in the current debate. So, to specify my own positions a little bit, when I first started thinking about these things, I didn't use the term Anthropocene. I was not clever enough to come up with a new word that would instantly indicate the importance of the ongoing scale, scope, and pace of global environmental change. But I was thinking about these things 20 years ago, and I argued that the 20th century as a whole was something new in the relationship between humankind and planet Earth, and indeed it was something new in the history of life on Earth and the history of the Earth. Beyond that, I actually said that it was the post-1950 period that was most distinctive. And in saying this, I really should have invented the term Anthropocene, but I was too dumb and didn't think of it. When I was thinking in these terms, I was influenced, I believe, I'm looking back on this and trying to remember what I was influenced by, partly by Christian Pfister's arguments, the Swiss historian of climate, argument about the significance of the 1950s in Switzerland and in Europe. And to some extent, he argued beyond, but he was mainly focused on Switzerland in Europe. More fundamentally, I think I was influenced simply by the curves of energy use and population growth, some of which I'll show you in a moment. And I was, I'm sure of this much, powerfully influenced by a paragraph in a book written by Carlo Cipolla, the Italian historian of technology, among other things. He's a very versatile historian. He has a passage in this tiny little book, which is only 100 pages long, a passage in which he explains that if the contemporary rate of human population growth in the 1950s and early 60s, this book was published in 1962, if that contemporary rate of population growth continued for just a few more centuries, It had only been going on for a decade or so at that point. For a few more centuries, the Earth would be encased in a mass of human flesh expanding with a radial velocity greater than the speed of light. Now, I knew that wasn't going to happen. But it was a spectacular image of the implications of compound growth, exponential growth. And that helped me to think about how weird it was that for a while human population was growing by 2% or 2.1% per annum, and energy use was growing much faster than that. So this is, I think, what convinced me that the post-1950 period was indeed something bizarre, anomalous, unprecedented, and radically unsustainable. A few years later, not far from here, in Dahlem, I met Paul Crutzen for the first time. And together with Will Steffen, Paul Crutzen and I authored an article which I think is called Stages, the subtitle is Stages of the Anthropocene. The title is something like, Are Humans Now Overwhelming the Planet, or some anodyne phrase like that. At any rate, in this article, the argument was different. The argument was that the Anthropocene really began in 1800, and that post-1945 is a second stage in the Anthropocene. The sort of thing that stratigraphers don't tolerate is stages, or they don't easily tolerate, stages of the Anthropocene. And at the time, it wasn't exactly the argument that I wanted to make, but it was the argument that I agreed to, because when you co-author a paper with a Nobel Prize winner, you don't actually get the final say. At least I don't get the final say. Maybe some of you can do better. So my Anthropocene now, the way I think about it, is a little bit like the way I thought about it when I wrote Something New Under the Sun, and not quite the way I thought about it 10 years ago in Dahlem. And it is an Anthropocene that is defined by two main things. One, the fundamental biogeochemical cycles of the planet now being strongly influenced by human activity. So this is the nitrogen cycle. That, to me, is something that marks off the post-1950 period from all prior history. Second thing is this basket of variables. These are put together by Will Steffen and the International Geosphere Biosphere Program team, and I'll show you another slide in just a moment that makes this a little bit more comprehensible. But this is 1950 right here, and everything is skyrocketing as of the middle of the 20th century. And many of these things are sort of outside the envelope of the Holocene range of variability. The stratigraphers with whom I've been rubbing shoulders for a few years are much less interested than I am in why these things are happening. For my money, the two big issues are energy use and global population. There are other things going on, but for me, a person who's interested in causation, those are things that also indicate that we're in a new interval of geological time. And I want to emphasize that my Anthropocene has nothing to do with the advent of human impact on the Earth. Many times I find myself in discussion with people who either take a different view of this or, less charitably put, misunderstand the concept of the Anthropocene and want to make it synonymous with human impact on the biosphere or human impact on the Earth, which of course goes way back. And one of my neighbors, Earl Ellis, sometimes likes to argue that the mass extinctions at the end of the Pleistocene should be understood as the beginning of the Anthropocene. So my view is fundamentally different from that. And there are people who think that the harnessing of fire, whenever that happened, 1 million years ago perhaps, should be recognized as the beginning of the Anthropocene. I think it loses meaning when understood in those terms. So here are some of the basket of variables that Will Steffen and his colleagues assembled, which are part of the reason that I choose the Anthropocene that I choose. And so many of them, of course, they were cherry-picked and selected precisely for this purpose. So many of them demonstrate the significance of the middle of the 20th century. And I say they were cherry-picked for this purpose, that is true, but they're also decidedly non-trivial indicators of trends in the Earth system and the human system or social system. So that is the Anthropocene. This got scrunched a little bit. That is the Anthropocene to me. And I wanted to explain how I got to that one and what its characteristics are before getting into my anthropological narrative of life among the stratigraphers. So, most of you are probably aware of what the Anthropocene Working Group is and the various bodies that it reports to. There's a sort of nested hierarchy of organs that each have sovereignty over whether or not changes should be made in the system by which geologists periodize the history of the Earth. But a little bit about the AWG. First, who is it? It's mostly British geologists. Here are a number of them. This was a gathering, I think this is the Norway, Oslo gathering, the most recent one. It is, as Jürgen said, now 38 people, but it's been growing since it was created 8-9 years ago. Its purpose is narrowly defined to make a recommendation as to whether there is a geological basis, a stratigraphic basis for a new interval of geological time, the Anthropocene, and if so, what is that geological and stratigraphic basis? And that is all that the AWG is authorized to do. What it actually does is debate and discuss this issue, lots of related issues, including some tangentially related issues, and write a paper every 2 months or so, which has been great for me because now my dean and provost think that I'm a worthwhile citizen because my name is on papers that appear in prestigious science journals. Wonderful for me, even if I have very modest input into these papers. So that's what the AWG does. It does its work mostly as an email group. It has met in person 4 times, briefly, every time in Europe, every time during my semester. So I've never attended any of those meetings in person. But I have taken a moderately active role in the email discussions, which are the heart and soul, 90% of the AWG's work. It is, I think it has a core membership that interacts more tightly, and these are British geologists themselves who see one another regularly because they all live in Britain. The AWG in the fall of 2016 made a recommendation up the chain of command, so to speak, the Subcommission on Quaternary Stratigraphy, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, to the International Union of Geological Sciences at its Cape Town meeting. I think it was October of 16. And recommended that, yes, the Anthropocene should be considered seriously, and a post-1945 Anthropocene is the best Anthropocene. The response was, okay, give us more data. We're not ready to make a decision. And that means that the Anthropocene Working Group now is embarked on a quest for a specific kind of data, a golden spike. That is something in the earth rock itself or the ice that serves as the marker between one interval and the next of geological time. And that is, since October of 16, the main activity of the AWG. And as a result, I'm a bit less involved because I have, that's a technical question, and I have no training in stratigraphy, so I have less to say about the current activities of the AWG than I did for the previous few years. I have been a member only since 2013. So the AWG was up and running for a few years before a minor accident of history took place, which accounts for my membership of the AWG. The chair, Jan Zalasewicz or Zalasevich, I met him at a conference in Chicago in 2013. He asked me to become a member. I was skeptical. He assured me there wouldn't be much work involved, and the fact that I was not a geologist would not be held against me. So I said yes, and since then I have been embarked on this interesting anthropological adventure, interacting on a weekly basis, more or less, with stratigraphers. And in a moment I'll explain some of the curiosities that result from that. My own contributions have been to work on these papers, trying to prevent the odd historical error, maybe get some of the passive voice out of their writing, but the fundamental decisions I have had no input on. That is, what should we write a paper on next, for example? Eccentricities of the AWG. From the point of stratigraphers, there are two main curiosities about the AWG. The first one is that it has lots of people who are neither stratigraphers nor paleontologists on it. That is unusual for a working group of the International Commission on Stratigraphy. It might be unique, I'm not sure. It's at the very least very unusual. The second curiosity from the stratigrapher's point of view is that its whole arc of work is backwards from a normal working group. A normal working group results from years and years of study of rock, which generates a new idea about how the past should be sliced up into intervals of time. This one is the reverse of that, an idea that came from outside the community of stratigraphers. And as you all know, it's mainly associated with Paul Crutzen, although he does not claim to be the originator of the term or concept. Came from outside the community of stratigraphers. The idea came first, and it has led to what the AWG is most energetically doing now, which is searching the world's rock and ice for suitable golden spikes to mark the advent of the Anthropocene. So it looks weird to many people in the stratigraphy community. From the perspective of a historian, it also looks weird, but for entirely different reasons. The first of which is it exists. So my tribe, historians, we argue about periodization all the time, but we never make formal recommendations about it. We never vote on it. We don't have a chain of command that claims sovereignty over how periods of the past should be recognized. Anybody can do anything they like. We could have the Franz Malshagen period in the history of Berlin. I could claim that that exists, and nobody would. They might not pay attention, they might not take this up, they might not agree with me, but I can do it. Nobody can stop me. Maybe I'll do this.
Or the Parker minimum.
Or the Parker minimum. So historians are anarchic in the schemes of periodization, and different parts of the world have different schemes. So the very fact that stratigraphers are trying to formally decide whether the Anthropocene exists or not is weird. A second thing that's weird from a historian's perspective, at least to me, I'm not sure everybody would see this the same way, is this, the emphasis on durability in those golden spikes. So one of the things that we've discussed is whether the residue of plastics, which is all over the place, and is the great preponderance of it is post-1945, whether this could serve as a suitable golden spike, marking off the Holocene from the Anthropocene. But the question has arisen, what is the preservation potential of plastics? Will they be there in 10,000 years or 100,000 years or 1,000,000 years? To me, this is really weird. Why does it matter that plastics might not be there in 1,000,000 years or 100,000 years? To me, we're not going to be here in 1,000,000 years. If there are geologists in 1,000,000 years, they aren't going to think the way geologists think now. So trying to find a golden spike that is going to be recognizable and meet the criteria of stratigraphy today and is going to be there in 1,000,000 years seems illogical to me. But it's not, from the point of view of many of the stratigraphers, all the other golden spikes, all the other markers have been there for millions of years, or in one case for 11,700 years. And so honoring that tradition makes sense to stratigraphers. To me, it seems irrational and nonsensical. Stratigraphers also emphasize that they want synchronicity and, if this is a word, globality in the golden spikes. So a new interval of time, it should ideally be observable all over the world, or at least many points in the world, at the same time. So for historians, this also seems peculiar. We don't care if a certain period began sooner in one place or another, or if, let's say, the interwar period was shorter in Germany than it was in the United States. That's okay. But it's not okay for stratigraphers. They want a synchronous marker. Two other things that seem a bit strange to me about the business of the AWG is that it is essentially a hobby. All the AWG members are working in time that they steal from their routine responsibilities. That's true of me, it's true of all of them. It's much more onerous for most of the others who do a lot more work than I do. And none of them have any funding for this. So it's all a sideline, a hobby. And equally unstructured is the recruitment of new members. It's kind of mysterious. I only know how I joined, and I know a couple of people who wanted to join, and weren't admitted to the club. I don't know why. Why certain people are in and other people are not in is it's mysterious to me. And there's no formal process that I'm aware of. I think it's the core group in Britain who discuss and decide, but I don't even know that for sure. So there are certain wildly informal aspects to the AWG which contrast with the formal ambition of stratigraphy of defining rigorously a new interval of geological time. And the last curiosity about it seems to me that the AWG and the geology profession at large is not in much of a hurry to sort this out. It took a long time to finalize the definition of the Holocene and the golden spikes. There's more than one of the Holocene. And it could be, who knows, that we'll all be long dead before the final decision is rendered on the Anthropocene. Now, a few last words, because I haven't managed the time very well, about what all this might mean from the point of view of my home discipline, history, and what it might mean for the whole notion of disciplines. So, historians, oh dear, this got a little bit mucked up in translation from PC to Mac. Sorry about that. Historians, like a lot of scholars in the humanities and social sciences, are trying hard to make use of the Anthropocene concept. To me, it's remarkable how fast it has taken hold. This is a chart of the number of articles with the word Anthropocene in the title, and it's kind of like those curves I showed a moment ago, except this is not 1950, it's 2010, after which it seems to be an Anthropocenic explosion in scientific, social scientific, and humanities literature. That only goes to 2015. If I could have it through 2017, it would continue this steep exponential rise. So that seems to me remarkable, and historians are a small part of that, but many are eagerly embracing the concept. I have Darwin here because I couldn't think of any concept that has taken hold across the intellectual landscape like the Anthropocene as successfully since Darwin's ideas about evolution. No doubt I'm overlooking something, but I haven't figured it out, whatever it is. So for historians, the Anthropocene, I think, has some utility, helping us to put the last two human generations into perspective as wildly anomalous and bizarre time in human history, in environmental history, as well as in the history of the Earth and life on Earth. I think it helps us, historians, engage with the deeper past, which has been not a very popular undertaking among historians. But I think that's beginning to shift, and the concept of the Anthropocene is part of the reason. I also think, and you can't read it here because I've inadvertently obliterated it with that chart, that the Anthropocene concept also helps historians think about what their work might mean for the future. Historians usually don't worry about that, and certainly aren't very good at trying to envision the future. But just as the Anthropocene concept invites us to think about the deeper past, I think it also invites us to think about what our work might mean for the future in ways that, as a profession, we have rarely done. Is there anything that historians can do to help crystallize the concept of the Anthropocene? The short answer, in my opinion, is not much that I can think of. Maybe you can think of other things. So to date, I think the input of historians has made matters less clear, has made the concept more fuzzy, introduced more uncertainty about what we should understand by the term Anthropocene. But it is possible that historians will add a useful dimension to these debates by virtue of our obsession with causation. The stratigraphers with whom I deal